Welcome to Pretty Lies and Alibis. Let's seek the truth and travel the long road to justice together. What you know, Alibiers? Happy Wednesday again. It is 11:40 p.m. I just got finished with the last part of testimony for the day, and I have over 20 pages. It's going to be a little bit longer than that first one, but I feel like this testimony is too important to skip over anything. So let me just tell you guys how exhausted I am. About an hour ago, I'm sitting here listening, typing, and all of a sudden, I literally think, what if like all along it was really Jake and Angela? So, okay, don't worry, guys. I haven't totally lost it, but I do, as I always say, think like a juror. And I think that it was risky putting George on the stand in a big way because defense attorney Parker, who has been doing the direct with George, has touched on every single bit that is pretty major. Didn't really go into anything so far about the actual murders themselves that night. And I guess he is playing it as if George was never there because that is still the defense. George did not know. But an hour ago, y'all, I literally I tweeted this out. I didn't put it on Facebook because I was just crazy busy, but that was my thought an hour ago. So I'm going to get this in so I can go to bed and get refreshed for tomorrow. Real quick, I have to give a shout out to everybody who offered to be a mod on the YouTube channel. I appreciate it. I've got some emails. I'll be getting back with you guys in the next couple of days when it's not super, super busy. Then I have to give a big shout out to RJ locally here at Benson of Greer. I'm not getting paid for this, but I was having some issues with my Jeep that were kind of scary and a little dangerous. And RJ totally took care of it this weekend, and I couldn't be happier. So if you're in the upstate and you want a good Jeep, Chrysler, Dodge, whatever they sell, go see RJ at Benson and Greer. He will absolutely take care of you. 100%. All right. Quick song fact. I've been in a 90s country mood all weekend, y'all. I'm talking like Brooks and Dunn, Garth Brooks, Trisha Yearwood, Reba, Alan Jackson, just Alabama, going back to all the really good songs. And so I thought tonight I would do a little country fact. So the best-selling country song of all time is Johnny Cash, "I'll Walk the Line." Love that song. Reminds me of my grandpa. Okay, so one thing George always says in response to Parker when asked about certain things, how far back do you want me to go? There's so much history with this family, and between Jake and Angela, the wiretaps, and then now George's testimony, you really are starting to get a pretty good picture of everything about these people. And I'm going to tell you, towards the end of testimony, there was like this big shocker where I was like, "What?" And we'll get to that. All right, let's get going, guys. Also, real quick, I'm sorry before we get started. Me, Anjanette, and Big E, as soon as George is off the stand for good, and he's been cross-examined, redirect, whatever. We are going to do another live where we just talk about this testimony and what we thought and what was good about it, what was bad about it. I am so excited. I had a blast last time. They are just so fun to do this with because it was like having a chat with friends on the front porch with some coffee in hand. So, yeah, you guys keep your eye out for that. We're going to find a time that works for all three of us so we all three can be back. So, super excited. All right. So, where we left off, this was after lunch where I'm picking up now. First episode was the morning session. Now we're in the afternoon. And George said during his divorce with Tabby, he said he didn't trick her about custody. When she left, she told him she was not mentally, physically, or financially capable to take care of Vine, and she wanted him to stay there. So defense attorney Parker shows George a document, January 11th, 2012, which is his wedding day. And I'm putting this on the screen. There'll be a link in the description with this. And George names all the people in this photo, which includes Jake with his hand on Angela, Billy in the back. You have Hannah Mae, Chris Sr., Frankie, little Chris, George, and Tabby on their wedding day. And George says his family isn't any different from any other family as far as he knows. And so he said they fought and argued. And so Parker's like, what other families are you referring to? Because even Parker's like, yeah, this family's not normal. So he starts naming off his uncle Chris Newcomb, his Aunt Robin, who lives on Flying W and has most of her life. She's almost 60 now. His cousin Katie, distant family, they all lived together for, it seems like, most of their lives. We know Chris lives with his mother and also his grandmother. So we talk about the Rotens. Now, don't get me wrong, we're not talking about the Rodens. The Rotens is a family from Virginia who leased their property to hunt on some of the year during deer season. And their names are James, Rick, and Edie. And they started hunting there in 2005. And he hunted with them some, and they all became friends. And James is just 2 years older than him. By the way, if I talk funny, I bit the fool out of my tongue earlier, and it's like I probably need stitches. It's that bad. He said Rick was like a second dad to him and gave him a lot of good advice. A lot different from the advice Billy gave, which is like, don't get caught, always be aware of where the cops are, and that kind of thing. Rick told him to stop what he was doing and not go down the same path that his dad Billy was going down. He said it took him a long time to get it out of his system, but eventually he did, and he took that advice. He said it was really around the time that him and Tabby got married that he straightened up. Once Vine was born, he gave up his partying completely. Now, George visited the Rotens in Virginia several times. He would go up there to hunt and fish. So his friend, he was telling a story. His friend James got married the same year George did, just like a few months later or whatever. And he said the wedding was in Virginia and it was on the opening day of deer season. And he said he never missed an opening day in his life except for his friend's wedding. George says he is a deer addict. He eats, breathes, and sleeps deer. Bethel was one of the best properties he said he ever had hunted on. In the beginning, he would just hunt at night with Billy. But once he met Rick James, I keep hearing it in my head, like, super freak. Um, he started hunting in the day. He would start 2 to 3 hours before the sun would come up, and then he would come back home 2 to 3 hours after sundown. He talked about being in a deer stand all day. And so deer season is last Saturday in September, and it runs through the first week in February. He would hunt as much as he was able to get away and get in the woods. And this caused a lot of problems with Angela. And so he would spend 2 weeks a year hunting with the Rotens, with James and Rick. And he just admitted, like, he abandoned his work on the farm completely, and he said that also caused problems. And at one point, Rick even said to George, like, "You need to do what you're supposed to do," but George said, "No, deer hunting." He said even when they weren't there hunting with him, he would be gone hours a day, and Angela would tell him that Jake was, the poor one left to do everything. At one point, Rick had told him if he didn't change his ways of stealing with Billy, it would end up bad for him. Um, Eventually, he said when he quit helping Billy, it was in late 2014. He said it was around the time that he was hauling cows with Wagner Trucking after they had bought that from their neighbor. George said really he was just tired of looking over his shoulder, and he ultimately did not want Vine to follow in those footsteps. Billy always told him it, like stealing the fuel or the loads out of the truck, it doesn't hurt the driver, just the company. But George says as he got older and started doing this kind of stuff, and talked to other drivers, he realized it did hurt the driver because he knew drivers that just couldn't get hired because they had lost too much stuff on the road. So he just didn't want to take the chance of hurting just your blue collar worker. And that really what Billy told him just wasn't true. It did hurt the little guy. And he said Billy's motto was, "You don't steal from an individual, just corporations." They showed an overhead picture of Peterson, and he identifies all the major landmarks on that property. He points out the hunting cabin, and he said he actually moved that because it was very sentimental to him. Him and James and Rick built it together. So then they jump over to where did Vine sleep at night? And George said it really depended on his mood. Sometimes it would be with Angela, sometimes it would be with him, sometimes he would sleep with both of them, just alternate. Now, this is interesting. They asked defense attorney Parker asked if he had a TV in his room, and he said he did not. Now, remember, on the morning of the murders, it hit me. Jake said when they got back and were watching the news that the kids were in George's room watching cartoons as they watched the news coverage. He said he did have a Bluetooth speaker in there for his iPhone that he used pretty much every night. George said Jake and Hannah Mae in the beginning was more of Hannah Mae kind of hanging out at the house. And eventually Hannah Mae said, he's mine. He said it was good in the beginning and he liked having her around because she was like a baby sister to him. Her and Billy were always goofing off as well. Angela and Hannah Mae would bake together, they would cook together. And he said Hannah Mae followed Angela around, quote, like a little lovesick puppy. He thought they had a good relationship, and he really doesn't remember the relationship between Hannah Mae and Angela going sour. But he said towards the end of the relationship, Hannah Mae and Jake fought a lot. He was in Kansas when Jake and Hannah Mae called and said they were splitting up. But he said Hannah Mae and Jake were like light and dark. Hannah Mae wanted to do normal teenage stuff and Jake didn't want her to, but George said she didn't get to be a teenager after she met Jake. So he understood that part of her, or at least George said he did. So he's asked if he's religious and he says yes and no. He doesn't look at things like most religious people do. He said he does believe in God, but he doesn't believe that God interjects himself into things. Kind of more man's own choice, I guess, is what he was saying. He said Jake, on the other hand, is a religious fanatic. He said all he's done all his life is point out people's flaws, try to save their souls, and scream that they're going to hell if they don't listen, which George said Jake learned that directly from Angela. So he said that Jake got him in trouble a lot. George and Chris Newcomb would go fishing when they were young before they had their driver's license, and they weren't allowed to cut around the road on the four-wheelers to get to the farm. But they did it anyway, and Jake would always run and tell, which would result in George having his four-wheeler taken away. So I just lost. There we go. Every month for about 2.5 or 3 years, Billy and Angela were running pills down to Florida. They would go to a doctor there and get an x-ray, and then they would get a prescription. Now, there was an objection, and so we didn't really go much further on that. But they would leave Jake and George on the farm alone when they were gone. And George said he was about 15 or 16 at the time, which would put Jake at about 14 or 15. George said he loved being on the farm without Angela and Billy there because he could go hunt or fish whenever he wanted. So on a couple of different occasions, he got in trouble. When they got home, they found out Jake had went to Samantha's house, and so they blamed George for not keeping Jake at home. Another time he got in trouble was when Jake brought Hannah Mae, little Chris, and one of Hannah Mae's friends over, and they blamed George for allowing Jake to bring them over. And George said it's just not fun getting the blame for something. So he's asked to describe Jake, and George said he's over-opinionated, selfish, greedy, very jealous. Angela is over-opinionated and thinks she's better than everybody, and he said she's very manipulative. So he was asked for an example of Angela being manipulative, and he said after Vine was born, she would use Vine to guilt George into staying home at night. So what Angela would do, according to George, is tell Vine that George was choosing deer hunting or women over him. And he said, you shouldn't ever tell a 3-year-old that. He said the arguments would be George telling her she shouldn't be telling Vine things like that. And then it would just become a full-blown back and forth. He said as a kid, before he started driving trucks, he was a good person. He's talking about Billy. So when George was a kid, Billy was pretty active in his life, it seems. But when he started trucking and taking those pills, he would have these outbursts. And George says as he got older, Billy really didn't change any. He just stayed that way. Angela treated Vine and Sophie good in a way, excuse me, but he said in a lot of ways, looking back, he thinks really she tried to start over with Vine and Sophia. He said that his mom saw him as a failure, and really with Vine, because we know that Jake testified that that Vine was sort of the favored grandkid out of the two. Um, George felt that Angela really tried to get a restart with Vine. Angela would constantly tell George to leave the house just to get him out. And when he came back from Alaska, that Angela was trying to get him to sign custody of Vine over to her, saying that George was a bad influence on him and constantly with Chris Newcomb, and that Chris and George, or that George was going to ruin Vine's life, and it would be better if he just moved out and left Vine with her, which I thought was interesting, but it did sort of surprise me because the dynamic that sort of I'd imagined was that as long as it was a Wagner, one of the four, you were golden. But, George's recollection of events from childhood on is his, and it sounds like Angela would have turned, and she did turn on George. I was gonna say she would turn on her kids on a dime, but really she did. She took the stand against George. And she kinda turned on Jake too because she confirmed what he said, but still. As a kid, he oh, I'm sorry. So they talked about the family meetings. He said it was really more just discussion of who was paying bills and things like that. When he was asked about the family dynamics, George asked on the good days or the bad days. He said on good days, they would maybe get 3 or 4 hours of good in, and the majority of the time, it was just constant yelling and screaming at each other. He said they really just didn't get along, and Beth testified to that when she was on the stand that she had never been around people who yelled so much. If you remember the first time she met them, they were all yelling, which George tells the story why later. So they bring out a picture, and George's face kind of drops. And so he's asked about the goose box, and he says it was built for his grandpa at his father's request for his grandpa's birthday. This was in early February of 2016. He said both he and Jake built it, and it took a couple of hours, maybe 3 at most to build. If you remember, Angela had said that George stopped working on it and Jake was left with most of the building of it. But according to George, it took 2 to 3 hours and they both did it. So George took the goose box to the Flying W in his truck, and it was a 2000 Chevy 2500. Angela, Jake, and the kids were with him when he did it. So defense attorney Parker shows pictures of the lake, and George shows exactly where he put it in, where he drove his truck around. And it was taken out of the truck by him, Jake, and Billy. Remember, at this point, Billy's living at the Flying W. It got slid in, he said, by a tree. So I'm assuming maybe they tied a rope around a tree and got it down in the water. Then he took his truck to the other side and pulled it across the water with a rope. And he said he had George point to where that goose box was placed on the lake. It was built out of pressure treated plywood and foam on the underside, and it was anchored with 2 steel bars that were 6 by 8 feet, and they got those from the Flying W Farms in a trailer that his grandparents had on the property. George didn't go into the water, and he saw the goose box every time he went fishing at the lake. He said the geese never used it. He said his grandfather was obsessed with Canadian geese, and there were a lot on that lake, and he had nesting boxes all over the place for them. So Parker asks about the concrete buckets, and George said he had never seen them before and he didn't know the contents of those buckets. But on Bethel, they start talking about a gun safe, and he said it held 36 guns and it was around 6 feet tall and it was made of steel. They moved that gun safe to Peterson after they burnt the house down and moved. They loaded it onto a trailer and put it in the mud room at the Peterson residence. And they kept the majority of the firearms in there, as well as legal documents, cash money, anywhere between $5,000 to $20,000 in there at any given time. And the safe combination was mainly known to Y'all, my brain and my mouse like got this little disconnect right now. Bear with me. It's midnight, literally on the dot. He said that Jake, George, and Billy, the three of them, knew the combination. Angela knew it at one time. He wasn't sure if she remembered it. George said he preferred to keep cash in there because he didn't trust banks. He said on average, the number of guns were from 10 to it being completely overstuffed with guns. He said he kept his Model 17 9mm Glock in his room and 3 to 5 different guns in his truck at any given time. In his truck, he had a Glock 17, an AR-15, a 22 Hornet 270, and on average, either a 22 or a 17 HMR. And when asked, why did you keep so many guns in your car? He said he had different guns for different reasons. He had some for hunting, some that he would sell, some that he would trade, some that he had bought. So he got a different gun weekly through trading or buying. And we know that that was something he did with Chris Newcomb. Angela had a cheap revolver in the beginning of their time on Peterson Road, and she kept that in a cubby in the kitchen. Super safe having kids around, right? And later, she replaced that with a Glock Model 42 and kept it in the same place. If you've got kids in your house and your guns are not in a gun safe, you're a moron. They talk about Angela being in the military, and he said he knew she was, but he never once personally ever saw her shoot a gun. Billy didn't have weapons at Peterson. Jake had guns in the safe, and he also kept a Remington 12 gauge on a deer head in his room. So then they're talking about the trade days. We've talked about that kind of consistently over this trial. He's went there. He said he's gone since he was a little kid. He would buy and trade guns there as young as when he was 12 or 13. He said him and Chris Newcomb together have bought and sold thousands of guns together. So he's asked, how do you do that? Do you see something you like or buy or you trade them? And he said, yeah, if I see something I want to buy, I buy it. If I see something I want to trade, I trade it. Billy taught them that gold, firearms, drugs, and alcohol would always be valuable. So he said what he would do is George himself would trade a $500 gun for a junk car that was worth, ultimately 2 to 3,000. So he would take the aluminum wheels off, take the battery out, cut the converters off of the batteries and sell that separately. And then he would sell the rest of it to a junkyard. He said, depending on the price of scrap, he could profit $3,000. And so it was a good deal because he traded a $500 gun for it. He did that with Chris Newcomb a lot. And I'll just say this. Let me tell you something. George is a very smart guy when it comes, you can tell, to auto mechanics, firearms, that kind of thing. Trucking, when he gets into him and Jake getting hired on as tandem drivers, he just spurts this stuff off and doesn't even have to think about it. It's just, we know George really went to school up until the age of 14. And earlier in the day, he said it was, in fact, Angela who took the test for him to get his diploma. So he's one of those guys, and I know a million of them around. My dad's one. My dad made it to 10th grade and dropped out and has run a successful business for 30 years and has 5 patents across the world. Like, it's just kind of proof that, like, you don't have to have a college degree or even a high school diploma to be super, super smart. And I just saw a lot of that in George and how he retains things as far as that stuff goes. Just an observation. So then he's asked about the tattoo on his left arm. And he said it's a camo scent blocker shield brand for deer hunting. And it's clothing that blocks human scent from deer to keep them from running off if they smell a human scent. George said he has spent thousands of dollars on their product. So on the right arm, the first tattoo was a coming C. And he said he was actually 13 or 14 when he got that tattoo. Over time, he didn't like it over the years, and he got a discount on that first tattoo because the shop owner's kid did it, and it was his first tattoo ever. He said the C turned out okay, but what was supposed to be smoke turned out to look like bubbles. So people made fun of that tattoo. They called it bubbles, and he decided to cover it. So according to George, Billy asked if he wanted to get his tattoo covered up because Billy was going to get him a new tattoo, and he offered to pay for the cover up. He said he remembers this because Randa and Chris were actually having their first child as he's getting his tattoo. So he is shown a picture of the skull and 8-ball tattoo, and he didn't know the tattoo artist before getting this tattoo. He said the artist said there's a few options to cover it up. So he first hand drew the 8-ball on there, and then he just kept drawing. The artist added the skull, the spider, the web, the cards, and the dice to it. George said it was not his idea to have the 8-ball, but the artist said they were really limited on what was actually going to cover up that prior tattoo. When asked if he was okay with it, he said whatever covered it. George said he didn't pick it out, but he okayed it. And when the artist was done drawing, the only thing that would successfully cover up that tattoo was the 8-ball, something very dark. So he said the dead man's hand has no significance to him personally. It just went with the gambling theme that was kind of the artist's conception of the piece. So on Peterson, they start talking about the morning after the murders. He knew, so they kind of go back a little bit. He knew for years that Chris Sr. and Billy were friends, and he also knew him as Frankie and Hannah Mae and little Chris's dad. He said Billy and Chris Sr. knew each other from about the time he was 15 or 16. And he said before the murders, they were close friends and business partners. But then he says, are more like Billy was the tag along with Chris. George had been to Chris's house many times with Frankie. So George went to the 4th of July parties. He said he went actually every year except for the last year they had that last one before the murders. So then he's asked about Gary Roden, and he said he had talked to him some and actually had went hunting with him and Jake and Frankie in Kentucky. George was around 19 at the time, and they stayed 2 days. Jake also recalled that on the stand, if you remember. Thanks to Big E. We know because we got the notes. Go give Big E a follow, Chasing Paper 89 on Twitter, by the way. And give Anjanette and Jamie a follow, too. George knew Brentley really well, and he had only met Ruger once. He said he had been around Brentley more times than he could count. He said after him and Frankie started having children, they just couldn't hang out like they used to, but he still considered Frankie one of his best friends. He met Chelsea, who was Frankie's ex and the mother of Brentley, at Big Bear Lake back when he was kind of going to those bonfire camp out parties there. He had only met Hannah Hazel once, and he knew Dana from being at their house as a teenager. Little Chris was at the Pike County Fair the day Hannah Mae met Jake, and he talked to Kenneth once that he remembers and never went to his house. He had been to Dana's new residence one time. He said he stayed in the driveway when Jake was picking Sophia up. He said a couple of months before the murder. We know they moved in about a month before, but they were doing some remodeling there. So I don't know if that discrepancy maybe is before they actually moved in or what, or his timing's off. He didn't go inside, but he waited in the driveway for Jake maybe 10 minutes. He said he knew the house that Frankie was murdered in very, very well. He had spent a ton of nights over there, and all of them were there, meaning Hannah Mae, Little Chris, Dana, and Frankie. Normally, Frankie was known to sleep at his dad's some, and he said that Hannah Mae would be with Jake sometimes. But he said the Rodens were normal people, and he really liked them. So his attorney asks about Jake and Angela's testimony, and he says he was never aware that they were planning to kill the Rodens. He said they never talked about it with him. He said he knew no reason why they would want to kill the whole family. Jake never told him anything or asked for his help. Neither did Angela or Billy. He said if one had come to him and asked, he would have not believed it at first. He said he didn't think his family would be capable of something of this magnitude. So his defense attorney says, you talked about the thievery, the theft that you guys used to do, the arsons. Why would you think they wouldn't be capable of this? And George said, well, stealing is one thing, but murder is entirely different. He said if he had known they were planning, he doesn't know, but he said he would have never let it happen. So he's asked, "What would you have done to stop it?" And he said, "Honestly, I can't say what I would have done, but one way or another, it never would have happened if I'd have known." So we go to the morning after the murders, and he found out when Angela called and said for them to come home, and it was on the news the morning of the murders. We know they had went to tear down that storage building that Angela's dad had bought. She wanted the boys to go tear it down. It was near Lucasville, which was about a 45-minute drive away from Peterson. Him and Jake left around daylight, and the day before the murders, Parker walked him back. Defense attorney Parker, I'm trying to start addressing people by their title, walked him back. He said the day before the murders was normal stuff. He fed the animals. Billy brought Vine donuts, which George said he never stopped doing, even though they asked plenty of times. And Vine wanted Billy to stay, so he did. He said he never left the house that night to kill the rodents and Hannah Hazel. He said he didn't know Jake and Billy had left. And so he went to sleep around 10ish, and he doesn't think Vine slept with him that night. He doesn't recall waking up that night. And when he got up the next morning, he said Jake was in the living room, and George was going to get coffee like he does every morning. And Jake said they didn't have time for that and they needed to go so they could get back. And George said so he did. I'm going to tell you right now, Jake would have been hurt if he'd have denied me my coffee first thing in the morning. So they left, and George realized, as we know, they forgot the chainsaw back at Peterson. So they tore down what they could without the chainsaw. And they left with the intention of coming back to finish the job once they got the chainsaw. When he got back home, the news said people had been killed up on Union Hill Road, and Billy was freaking out, saying he couldn't get in touch with Chris Sr. Angela was in the mudroom, and Jake was outside on the phone. George said he was trying to get Billy to tell him what was going on, but Billy was just freaking out. Jake came in and said Andrew Carson told him that Hannah Mae, Frankie, and all of them had been murdered. When asked what his reaction personally was to that news, he said he can't put it into words. And defense attorney Parker tells him to think about it. Of course, he wants to elicit that response. And George said it was more heartbreak and trauma than he had ever been through in his life. He said he got on his four-wheeler and went up the hill behind his farm to go into the woods to calm down. He said that's his safe place. And he went by himself, and he stayed a couple of hours and came back. Samantha called him. Remember Samantha that testified that dated Frankie, that I think really had a crush on George. And then Tabby later called him. Jake was sitting in the living room, he said, in a daze. Billy was sitting there talking to Jake, and Jake wasn't responding. Angela was in the kitchen with the kids. He said at one point, Jake tried to go to Union Hill, but they wouldn't let him through, and he didn't see him leave to do that either. The next few days, Billy stayed at Peterson, which was unusual. Him and Angela ultimately couldn't stop fighting, so he left and went back to Flying W. George helped Bernie and some that week, and then about a week later got back on a normal schedule. He said none of them ever talked to him about the murders, and he never overheard them speak about it. He said he had no clue they were involved in it. So he admits that himself, his dad, and Bill and Jake went to Gary's viewing, and that was the first service that was held. George drove them in his truck, and he said it was everybody's decision to go. They didn't go to the funeral. They went to the viewing, and they never talked about the murders on the way they were back. He said Billy acted like Billy. Jake acted like Jake. And he said Jake never shows emotion. And I totally can see that. He shows improper emotion at the most improper times. He saw Jake laugh, smile, and smirk on the stand just a few weeks ago, and George said he had never seen Jake act that way before in his life. He said Jake won't let anybody but Sophie hug him. And so they then went to the viewing for the Roden family, And after that, they went to their funeral, and then they took his truck again, the 3 of them, to that viewing and the funeral. When they got there, Billy and Jake sat together, and George said he waited on Tabby and he actually sat with her. After the service, they went to the cemetery. George rode with Tabby to the cemetery. Jake and Billy rode together. George, after the cemetery service was over, George again drove Billy and Jake back home in the truck. He said he didn't know they were the ones who did it. So once the investigation really kind of starts, BCI or Pike never came to talk to him about the murders to him. He knew they talked to Billy once or twice, but Billy never told them what was discussed. He said it was the same for Jake. He was there at the house both times BCI came, and he was working on his truck the first time, and none of the agents came over to him to speak to him. The second time they were loading the trailers, this was after they sold the farm. They're loading the trailers to go to Alaska. And he said he didn't send uh, the first visit, he did not send Billy a text to tell BCI or to tell him that BCI was there. Now, if you remember the second time, George texted Billy, "We've got company, don't come over." So he admits to texting Billy and telling him not to come because Billy said BCI was incompetent and they were looking at the wrong people. And Billy said BCI would not listen to him when he told them who to look at. He said he was tired. George said he was tired of hearing Billy blame Skid Montgomery for the murders. George said ultimately he did not want Billy to spend hours on his conspiracy theories. And he said Billy was a conspiracy theorist his whole life. Billy said Pike County had been bought off by Skid. He said, George said that was something that he had heard from the time he was a little kid. And he also talked about Billy being a prepper, constantly thinking the world would end in his lifetime. And I don't know what it is about cases I cover and the end of the world, but it's getting a little old. Billy dug a hole with a backhoe, as we know, and buried a bread truck full of provisions in it, and also a sea box filled with the same kind of stuff. And that was on Bethel. George just thought it was pointless. But George said Billy was always paranoid, thinking people were listening to him through the TV. He kept tape over the camera on his cell phone, and he was paranoid about people listening through his phone. Makes you wonder, like, did he have paranoid schizophrenia or something? And I'm not making fun. I know actually a few people that have that, and they are doing well in life. But when you are convinced that people are bugging your computer and your TV and you've done nothing at that point, I mean, I don't think most of us, well, I don't know now though, y'all. I'll sit here and say, I'm going to say it now. I want to go to Italy. Tomorrow I'll have Italy ads on my phone, but not in the way that Billy thinks that people are listening. He said Angela was more paranoid in other ways. She thought everybody was going to kidnap him or Jake when they were little. She used to say it all the time when they were young. And I'm going to tell you, George had a little bit of a reaction to recalling this. And, I was thinking about it. It may be one of those things that as a kid, if your parent as a young kid is just pounding in your head that you're going to get kidnapped by bad guys, like that had to have been traumatic. Kind of similar to Jake's fear of going to hell because Angela was telling him he was going to go to hell or, somebody was going to hell. So, it just seemed like that was a little difficult for him to recall. And, maybe that kind of was a really bad memory for him. I mean, I can imagine if my mom is all the time saying, you're going to kidnap, you're going to get kidnapped, and you're going to start, that's going to be a bad thing for you to recall, probably even as an adult. So the family decides to sell the farm on Peterson to pay them out of debt. And he didn't, this is the decision to move to Alaska. Ultimately, Jake didn't want Sophia to grow up with what everybody was saying on topics in Facebook. He said that Angela and Jake were on that all the time. They would sometimes tell George about what they read, but he said he didn't see the point of getting into all the drama surrounding the rumors of the murders. George just thought they were wasting their time accusing people like Bobby Joe and Leonard Manley of anything. And he said that was just the wrong direction to be looking in. Or James Manley, I'm sorry. No way it was one of them. He thought the Wagners were being looked at because Jake insulted the Manley family constantly about the conditions of the inside and the outside of their homes. And he said at one point he rubbed it in that Leonard Manley had Frankie put the wrong transmission fluid in a car and it blew it up. And apparently that was something that Jake made fun of constantly. So George's perception was maybe the speculation is on us because, the way Jake treated the Manley family. Jake told him Leonard had pointed the finger at him and that BCI was on their trail for that reason. The original reason to go to Alaska was to get Sophie away from all the rumors. And at this point, Prosecutor Canepa says, I object to Parker continuing to testify. Please ask the questions. So that was sustained. Defense attorney Parker then asked who they knew in Alaska, and he names off a bunch of people other than the Cinereskis. George wanted to move because his family had talked about it for years, and he had fallen in love with it when he visited as a younger teenager. So they sold the farm. He said they paid themselves out of debt and went on a 2-week vacation to see if it was really where they wanted to be. He said on that trip, they all drove in the Suburban, and it took about 4 days to get to Alaska. They stayed in 3 hotels on the way up. Once there, he said he went fishing. He talked to people about jobs, places to live. He saw Caleb Cinereski and drove around the state of Alaska just looking at the sights. So then they come back to the lower 48, and we know they get stopped in Montana. He said they were interrogated there, and at the crossing, the officer took them into separate rooms and started talking to them. He said he was surprised because after the search warrants were executed in Ohio while they were on that scouting trip, Jake and Angela had called BCI and told them that they would come to their office and talk to them when they got back to Ohio. George said he found out about all the searches and he was mad because they were destroying all of Vine's stuff. And he was also upset BCI was still looking at them. He said he felt they were pointing the finger to prove to the people on topics and Facebook who said they were incompetent and didn't know what they were doing that they did by blaming the Wagners. He thought BCI was trying to frame Angela and Jake specifically. George did. George said all this affected his demeanor. He was upset with BCI and he was interrogated and he was in there for hours. He said BCI didn't accuse him of anything at first, started talking about hunting and fishing with him. Well, that's just how they loosen you up. With Angela, they had her kind of thinking, okay, yeah, this is kind of routine. We're just going to talk. And then they hit her with the Walmart receipt. And then it's like, that just escalated very quickly, didn't it? But then with George, they start talking about showing him photos of shell casings, Walmart receipts, and shoes. They said Angela had bought the pair of shoes and they were the shoes that were used the night of the murders. They also told him they found a shell casing at the crime scene that actually matched one of Billy's guns. He said he didn't believe them, and he said they were accusing Jake and Angela of being responsible, and it upset him that they would accuse his family. He said George had been driving to the United States he was the only one that drove in that one vehicle with these kids. And he said it was crowded in there. He said he had been driving for 2 to 3 days with little sleep. Nobody else drove. He said when he drove a truck, he would take 4 packs of Stacker, which are these Stacker 2, which are these caffeine pills he said you get at a Pilot truck stop. 8 to 10 Monsters or Red Bull energy drinks in a day, as well as 6 to 8 coffees in a day. I mean, I can do the 6 to 8 coffees, and I do, but man, I would hate to see like his kidneys. Have you ever seen where people that drink these monster drinks all day, they can get these kidney stones that are like the size of your head and their kidneys? It can mess you up. In Montana, his understanding at the end of the interview was that they were going to decide if George himself would either be a suspect or a witness, and they wanted him to spy on Jake. Okay, here's my question. Why did we not see or hear this interview with George at the border? I kind of feel like that if it were really super incriminating against George, they might have brought it in. I just wish we could have seen or heard it. Really. We only heard Angela's. We didn't hear Jake, Billy, or George's. But George said he did agree to spy on Jake. At the end of the interview, they brought Vine to him and they went to the car. He said Angela and Billy were outside waiting. We know Jake was still inside. He said he didn't talk to Angela or Billy, and he's asked why not. And George said Vine was acting very disoriented and really tired, which was not characteristic of how he normally acted. So he said after Jake came out and Sophia, they took Vine to the ER to see if anything was wrong with him. So it started off, according to George, that Sophia said BCI had given Vine medicine. So George wanted to make sure he was okay. George explains that Vine was very prone to bad anxiety attacks. And he wanted to be sure BCI didn't give Vine something to calm him down, which I'm going to tell you right now, guys. If you heard the chaos on the wiretaps and all that stuff, and you've heard from Beth and you've heard from Tabby, these kids, they're young at this point. They've been raised in a home where it sounds like the wiretaps, y'all, 4-minute clips was enough for me. And if you remember too, Beth said that during these arguments, the kids would go in the corner and like get physically aggressive with each other. It's, a lot of times kids live what they live in. And man, thank goodness they're not with this family anymore. So as we know, they found nothing in Vine's system and they went to the hotel. George drove there because the rest said they were just too stressed to drive. So George drove everybody. So if you guys remember, he leaves that hotel to drop Billy off in Ohio at the Flying W Farms. The rest went to Jackson to stay in a hotel. Chris Newcomb was going to help them clean up, and it was easier, he said, to be in Jackson to pick him up than to be elsewhere. So clean up meaning the trailers that still, I mean, when they do a search warrant and they go through stuff, they don't put your house back together, right? That's on you. So he talked to Jake after Montana, after they were stopped, and they were reloading on the farm. And he asked him if he had anything to do with the murders or knew anybody who did. And Jake denied both, said he didn't do it and he didn't know who did. George said at the time he had no reason not to believe Jake, and he never asked Billy and Angela. He said he didn't ask Billy specifically because he said he knew Billy would say it was Skid Montgomery. After they loaded the trailers, they decided to go back to Alaska, as we know, and they went from Ohio to Seattle. And at that time, there were 3 vehicles. George had his truck with a trailer. Jake had a trailer on his truck, and Billy and George, Angela and Billy took the Suburban with the kids. Once in Seattle, they shipped the Suburban to Alaska. Jake and George drove a highway called Alcan to Alaska. Took 3 to 3.5 days. Billy, Angela, and the kids flew to Anchorage. So he said the living arrangement for the first couple of days in Alaska was that Billy and Angela had a hotel. George said he slept in his truck. He said it's the only thing he's ever owned that's actually just been his. And he says his truck is like his castle, and he keeps everything in his truck. We know Angela found the home they lived in. It was a house trailer with an add-on. He said ultimately it ended up not being what Angela said. If you remember that wiretap, Angela's so excited and it's as if none of this stuff has ever happened and she just found her dream home in Alaska. So he said him and Jake went to different garages just to find work, and they found a place to work at Buddy's Garage. I had somebody email me that has a connection to Buddy's Garage, by the way. Hello. There were 6 people working there other than the owner. So George would do wrecker calls on the weekend, and he started out making $17.50. He was offered a raise at some point. So while there, he worked on cars as well as drove the semi-wrecker, which is if a larger vehicle like another semi or an RV needed towing, he would go out and do that. So he was on call, essentially. Jake also got the job there, but he had very different responsibilities. Essentially, Jake was being taught how to clean tankers out. George said that he personally loved that job, but he left because Keon Marina Diesel offered him $30 an hour, and so he took it. The owner of the garage he worked at, Buddy, told him it wouldn't be long before he was laid off, but he went anyway. At that point, Billy was working for the towing company, and the new place asked if George could get Jake to come over to them as well because the owner was trying to get more mechanics, and also that was Buddy's competition. They offered Jake $25 an hour compared to the $17.50 that he made at Buddy's. George said he worked there for 3 months, and ultimately what happened, he was laid off at the beginning of October, which is the beginning of winter in Alaska. 3 weeks later, Jake gets laid off. He said in Alaska, you can't find another job because everybody at that point in the season is getting laid off. So he spent all of his time with Vine. Angela, as we know, didn't work. She stayed home and watched the kids. And at some point, we know they decided to leave Alaska. George said he couldn't find another job there, and he was really homesick, and he missed Chris Newcomb and Random mostly. He started looking for jobs out of the state of Ohio. So he found the R&L carrier job in Kansas City, Missouri. They were hiring team drivers, and he said they're kind of always hiring team drivers. So that means you're always driving. When you do tandems, one person sleeps, one person drives, and that truck doesn't stop. So he was used to those kind of hours from hauling cattle with originally, if you remember, with him and Billy when Hannah Mae was pregnant with Sophia. Jake didn't work those first 3 months, and then eventually Jake came on. So he was really used to the tandem driving. And so he said also R&L was a really good company. They had great benefits. He was excited about starting retirement. And he said, above all, they took care of their drivers. He told Billy first. He said he knew he would easily win him over with the idea. So Billy just asked when to pack his bag to go to Ohio. So he was just talking about leaving Alaska. Billy, as we know, didn't want to go because his dad was sick and apparently didn't want to stay. So Jake and Angela, on the other hand, he said they're stubborn and they don't like to admit when they're wrong. So he said he turned Angela's trick against her and convinced Vine and Sophia that they missed their farmland and wanted to go home. He said it took him a month and a half to convince Angela. And he said once he convinced Angela, Jake was right behind her. But he said he didn't care if he had to live in a cardboard, or no, I'm sorry. So at first he convinced Angela. Jake said he didn't care if he had to live in a cardboard box. He was never coming back to Ohio. So then it kind of jumped around. So you'll get that in this timeline. And I'm sorry. Normally I'd put this in more chronological order, but I got to get up at 5 a.m. He met up with Josie, who used to actually live in Memphis. They reconnected in Alaska after she commented on a photo of him on a four-wheeler, which right here, I'm showing this on screen right now. If you're on YouTube, and I'll put it in the Google Drive. I'm actually going to be starting a website soon, by the way, where I'm going to put these photos. The next day, she usually comes to Kenai once a month. And so George told her when her and her husband were in town, that escalated, to text him, and he would love to meet up with them. The next day, she texted she was in town, and he said they went out to what he calls a Spanish restaurant without her husband, and they went back to her hotel. So the defense asked if anything happened in the hotel, and he said no. He would not do anything with a child in the room, and her son was with her, and he was maybe 6 months old at the time. She continued communicating, and he saw her a couple of times after that, and they were never intimate because she always had her son. He never said if they were separated or going through a divorce or anything. But ultimately, he told her that he was moving to Missouri for a job, and he said she really didn't have a reaction to that. He said he had other girls he talked to in Alaska as well, but nothing serious. Before he left for Alaska on the scouting trip, he left a lot of his guns at Frederica's on the Flying W because he didn't want them to rust in the trailers. The first trip to Alaska was when BCI executed that search warrant on the Flying W, and they took a lot of those guns, and he sold what they had left and not taken when he got back. He said the main reason is he didn't want to deal with trying to get guns across the border. He had heard it was a nightmare, and he just wasn't up for it. He said at any border crossing they made, they would keep them for hours. He said they were told it was standard procedure, but he had suspicions because they were holding them due to the murders. He said they were always searched and released. So we get to talking about Beth. He said he went to Caleb Cinereski's church a few times in Alaska. Jake started talking to Beth on Facebook. George remembers seeing Beth there the first time he went, and Jake was there at that church every time the doors were open. Angela went most of the time. George said in all, he went around 5 times, and Billy maybe once. Jake brought Beth to dinner one day. He called about an hour before they showed up and said he was bringing her. So there was a big argument this first time they met Beth because anytime George fixes Mexican food or goes out to a Mexican restaurant, he says he likes to have a beer with it, and so does Billy. So George cooked steak and mon tacos. Jake did not want George or Billy to drink a beer because he didn't want Beth to think he came from a bad home that wasn't a good Christian home. I mean, this is the guy who admitted to shooting 6 and murdering 5 humans, but we can't have a little sudsy with our mon tacos because it's going to look bad to the future wife. These people, y'all. George said, look, I don't change no matter who I'm with. He said they argued for a half an hour about this, and George said the end result, he had his beer. So did Billy. Of course, Angela sided with Jake. He said he had seen Beth, but this was really the first time he talked to her. She stayed a couple of hours, and she talked to Angela and Billy and the kids. His impression was that she was just at that point just a normal lady, and she just didn't talk to him very much that night, though. He kept seeing her, and for about 3 weeks, her and Jake were seeing each other, but then she broke up with Jake because Beth saw what he was being accused of after Googling his name and seeing it on the news. George said the crimes were publicized in Alaska on the local news station, and it said they were subjects of interest. This was anybody with information to call this number. George said he was not happy about that. George said when he first got to Alaska, he went to Sportsman's Warehouse to buy a Glock because he had sold his before they moved. So they sold him the Glock with no problems. But when he went back, they refused to sell anything to him. So they move on to the engagement between Jake and Beth. They got back together and continued dating and then ultimately got engaged. George had decided he was going to move back for this trucking job, and Jake said he wasn't leaving without Beth, and Beth said she wasn't leaving Alaska unless they were married. Now, this was interesting because he didn't elaborate, but George said he did not approve of Beth because he found out there were things she had discussed before, and we never learned what. And George said he didn't trust her. As we know, they got married, and George went to the wedding. He said the only help he gave them was right before the wedding in the middle of the night. He went into Anchorage to get champagne flutes for them. That was the bulk of his helping. We know they left Alaska the day after Jake and Beth got married, and he said everything was loaded up. They dropped Billy, Angela, and the kids off in Anchorage at a hotel across from the airport. George and Jake were going to drive straight through and meet them in Springfield, Missouri. We know Beth was having a problem with her passport at that time and joined them a little later. So George and Jake were driving separate cars, but once in Missouri, the plan was for George to take Billy back to the Flying W. He left as soon as he got there. He said he wasn't there very long at all and got back on the road, and he didn't spend that first night there. The drive to get Billy there and back was about 24 hours. He said he did stop over at Chris Newcomb and Randa's for a couple of hours. He said, number one, he missed them. And also Chris owed him a lot of money, and he was paying him back in firearms. He said they did keep in touch while they lived in Alaska. They FaceTime, called, texted, all that good stuff. So George went back to Missouri for the job interview at R&L, and that was in Kansas City, which is about an hour away from Springfield. Both him and Jake went, and the only thing they had available was what they call a line haul. So it's a day driving job. You drive during the day and you're home at night. He wanted a long haul because team driving was $400 to $500 more a week in income. And the team drive was only in Wilmington, Ohio, though. Jake said he wasn't getting any closer to Ohio than Missouri. George said he was going without him to get himself out of debt. And he wanted to drive until he retired and wanted to also buy his own farm and a new truck with this new income and the benefits he would be getting. Like Jake, Angela did not want to come back to Ohio, but Vine and Sophia wanted to come back. He spent hours arguing with the both of them, with Jake and Angela, about this. Angela threw a fit and said, "George, you have nobody to watch Vine." So George said, "Yeah, I got Billy and Aunt Robin." So Angela's like, I mean, she didn't do the voice, but they can't watch him. And then she agrees to go back. And then, of course, after Angela agrees, guess who says me too? The golden boy, Jake. He said this discussion took 3 or 4 hours total to get them both to agree to move back. They talked about getting the loans for the property in Missouri, and we know it was denied. He said it was weird that it was denied because him and Jake had just been approved for a $380,000 loan in Alaska. He said the job was why he wanted to come back, not the loan denial in Missouri, back to Ohio. He wanted a job he could retire from and not bounce around like he had his whole life. He and Jake got the job in Ohio, and he said it was the best job he ever had in his life. He said the money, the benefits, the retirement, he was bringing home about $1,800 a week after taxes and insurance were taken out. He and Jake made the exact same amount down to the penny. George said he was saving to pay his debt off, and they were living in Angela's dad's house at that point. And so they start talking about Angela's dad, and he said he was very close to him. He said him and his grandpa, which is George said he and his grandpa, Angela's dad, loved Thanksgiving. And he said they would literally start planning the next Thanksgiving like the day after, and they would plan for it up until the day it rolled back around. He said before they moved to Alaska, his knowledge of his grandpa's health was that he was fine physically. So Angela's dad died Thanksgiving morning while they were in Alaska. And I'm going to tell you guys, like, let me tell you something. Um, there was true emotion from George, like Angela. If you remember the one time on the stand that Anjanette and Biggie said that he showed emotion was talking about, or she showed emotion was talking about when her father died. Maybe it was just Biggie. I'm not sure. I don't want to put words in the lovely Anjanette's mouth. But he wanted to come back for the funeral, but their attorney was advising them, do not come back to Ohio. You could see the regret on his face and just the utter sadness in his eyes. And I'm not giving him sympathy. I'm just saying it was very, very visible. But you also know that his other grandfather, Billy's dad, died 2 months before his other grandpa did. Again, they were advised not to come for the funeral. So both he and Jake worked 5 days a week. It was Tuesday to around noon on a Sunday. He said that was the schedule, but usually they ended late Saturday night, a little early. Tuesday, they would go to Wilmington, Ohio to get their load. He said initially 1 week they might be in Texas, the next in New York. And seniority gets the first dibs on the good routes. But he said this Sacramento route came up and he put his name on it on the board. He said it's the same one every week and it's ideal because he said it kept him off the East Coast. And he said truck drivers hate driving on the East Coast because the rules are stricter. It's death to truck drivers. Traffic is bad. The DOT is bad. And you never make it off the East Coast without a ticket. He said they would, on this Sacramento route that he did get, They would load the truck in Wilmington on Tuesday morning, unload in Sacramento on Thursday around 6 a.m. From there, they would drive to Seattle, get a load, unload in Salt Lake City, reload, go to Kansas City or St. Louis. He said this was the only part that varied of their route each week. They would unload, get another load, go back to Wilmington. So the driving arrangements were that George drove 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. He said Jake would drive 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. He said Jake's pupils are deteriorating, so it's hard to see when the sun is coming up or down. And also, the glare from the headlights is very hard on his eyes. It's my little violin playing My Heart Bleeds for You. The truck had get this, guys. I need to look this up. And we got Trisha the trucker who listens to this. Trisha, I hope you're trucking, girl. You just keep on trucking. I did not know these things were souped up like this. Their truck had a top and a bottom bunk, a refrigerator, a desk, 2 closets, and a microwave. He said they never stayed at hotels. The truck never stopped unless they were loading, unloading, or putting fuel in. He said at the time that they were doing this driving down the road, his mindset about the investigation into the murders was okay. He said it was quiet, but at times Jake and Angela would tell him stuff that they had seen online, and people were still blaming the Wagners locally. He knew law enforcement wouldn't let up. And then they talk about the wiretaps, the obvious elephant in the room. The defense attorney says, "You were screaming and yelling." And George says, yes. He said he assumed the truck was bugged because of how Billy raised him, which was somebody's always listening. And also, Billy used to tell him, once law enforcement points their finger at you, you're going to be listened to. He asked if that influenced what he said on those, well, in the truck that was caught on the tapes. And he said, "I know a few times I acknowledged being listened to." And he also assumed that his phone was bugged as well. So George is shown a picture of Billy in this custom homemade leather outfit, and he's had many different motorcycles throughout his life. George rode them a lot, and Billy gave George his chopper. He said it was never in his name, but George said he himself loved riding. He said he especially liked riding on or driving the Bourget, because if he stopped at a red light or a stop sign, people would circle around it, and it was an attention grabber, and people would want to take pictures of it. And he said it was a beautiful bike. I have an example of that on the screen here. So, because he drove motorcycles, he said that he ordered this winter soldier mask because it covered the lower part of his face, but it stayed out of the way of his sunglasses and his hat. He said for daily wear, just average clothes, he would wear ripped up Wranglers, a black, he said a beater, which is a tank top, cowboy boots, and in the fall, he would wear a camo jacket and a hat. He said he dressed the same way his whole life. But on the other hand, Jake dressed a lot differently. We've heard that. He would wear American Eagle jeans and boxers, name brand stuff. So he's shown this photo of Jake that was taken at Peterson Road, and he said he hasn't seen that picture before, but he has seen that. He said Jake wore this outfit daily. It's a replica of Leon Kennedy's outfit, which is the lead character in the Resident Evil video games. And the jacket that he wore, I'm going to put it on screen here, it is an exact replica of what the lead character wore in Resident Evil. And George said he used to constantly make fun of Jake and told him he looked like a drug dealer wearing it. George has also shown a photo of the lockpick set that Billy got for them when they were younger. George says that is the exact same lockpick, but he said there are some missing from it. So they go on to talk about that Peterson Road security system. They had one on Bethel, and Angela wanted one for Peterson. So George and Jake put it up. He said mainly he was handing things to Jake. He was the one on the roof. He said that surveillance system stayed up on Peterson for 9 months, and it was taken down because in August or September of 2016, his grandpa Carter had his home broken into, and Angela wanted that surveillance system put on his house. Some people broke in, hit him over the head, took a bag of money and pills. George said he sold pills for a living, and he said everyone in that town knew that he did. He sold it in his front yard, and George said it was like a drive-through service. We know Grandpa Carter was paralyzed from the waist down. I believe he got electrocuted stealing copper from power lines when he was younger, and he was paralyzed from the waist down, but George said it didn't affect how he lived his life. George and Jake took down that surveillance system at Peterson, and George said he went alone to put it up on his Grandpa Carter's house. Jake said that day he had other things to do. So this was August or September 2016. He shows more photos. And I think, actually on one of the phone calls or wiretaps, they discussed George's ranting and raving, saying that wait till he finds out who did that to his grandfather. So he shows photos to George of the murder truck. He said he saw it once or twice. He said it was Uncle Toddy, who is Uncle Silas, and Billy came over in early 2016 and said Silas was selling the truck for the money. He needed it. Billy asked George if he could borrow the money to buy it. George said Angela threw a huge hissy fit and said, "Do not loan that money to your dad because he'll never pay you back." And also, she wanted that money for the farm. So George said he decided to let Billy have the money, and he got it out of the gun cabinet. He said the truck was in the driveway at Peterson the next day. He said when he saw the truck for the first time the next day, 15 or 20 minutes later, get this, Billy and Chris Sr. showed up. Billy gave him a hug and said he couldn't stay. Chris Sr. had drove Billy in his silver Ford to pick up that truck, and they each left in their different trucks. Billy in the murder truck. Eerie stuff, y'all. George said he never got in nor drove the truck, and he saw it again in fall of 2016. His uncle had driven it to the Flying W Farms, and George was there fishing with Vine. He said Uncle Bobby showed up in the truck, and he saw it again once at his Uncle Bobby's house once they moved back from Alaska. George said his cousin who got the truck was a little bit younger than Jake. He said the three of them were like stair steps. So she was a year younger, Jake was a year older. We know George and Jake are just a little more than a year apart. George said his cousin who got he said he didn't know the truck was used in the murders until Jake's proffer. They talk about George's arrest on November 2018, and it just occurred to me that was just a few days ago, marked the 4 years since the Wagners were arrested for these murders. So 4 years in the pokey. The defense says, "Do you know when this guilty plea was?" And George knew it was early last year. George learned about it from one of the sergeants actually at the jail, came and got him and took him down to booking. And he said he hadn't been there since his arrest. And he knows they only take you there when they want you out of the pod. So I kind of wonder if maybe that wasn't for his own safety or something. He said a few hours later, his other attorney, Rick Nash, came and told him that Jake pled guilty. George said he didn't know what to think and initially thought Jake had gone crazy in jail. He said Jake isn't social, doesn't get along with people at all, and maybe he just broke. George didn't think Jake did it, even though Jake pled guilty. At some point, he listened to Jake's proffer, and he said he couldn't understand how Jake could do that after he swore to him that he didn't. He said he felt heartbroken and betrayed after he took up for him. And then a few months later, he learns, guess what? Mommy Dearest pled guilty. He said he felt the same way, heartbroken and betrayed. He says he still has a hard time comprehending with the murders and dealing with it, that Jake would do it. They talk about Jake's testimony implicating him, and he said it's just not true. He never helped them before, during, or after the murders. They talk about Angela's testimony just, 2 weeks ago? He was asked how it felt to have your own mom testify against you, and he pauses. He is good 5-second pause. He said it was emotionally hard, especially since she wouldn't even look at me. He said he never told her about bloody footprints or knew she was involved in any way. They get to talking about the Boondock Saints because it wouldn't be the Wagner trial if we didn't talk about the Boondock Saints. According to George, he said he saw the first 10 minutes of it. He said his favorite movies are Across the Great Divide and Jeremiah Johnson. Both are timepieces based in the 1800s. But then his defense attorney says, "Well, why would Chris and Randa say Boondock Saints was your favorite movie?" There was an objection, and he said he never told them it was his favorite movie. He heard the clip in court, and he said he's never heard Jake talk like that. So that was interesting because Jake's Pastor Wagner in jail. Jake's holier than thou. I thought that was an interesting comment by George, actually. So they talk about the secret recordings of pickups with Sophia that Jake made. George says he didn't know that he was recording them. Then they get to the sexual abuse allegations, and he said he never thought she was being abused before the murders, and not until Sophia accused Beth of it. He said he wasn't aware that Jake and Hannah Mae had huge problems regarding custody. He said his understanding of their agreement was they got her a week at a time. And he said sometimes on Hannah Mae's weeks, she would drop Sophia with Jake saying she needed another day or two. Again, it goes back to that, she wanted to have fun. She was still very, very young. She was a teenager. He knows none of the Rodens would have ever done that to a child. I mean, he was pretty serious when he said it. He said he doesn't know why his family did this and he's trying to figure it out. He said he's been trying to figure it out for the past year and a half, or back to when Jake and Angela confessed. So back to Bethel Hill, he came home unexpectedly, y'all. I have debated even going over this because I really think a lot of Tabitha, right? Okay, I think she's brave. She is a survivor in a lot of ways. But we're going to do this, okay? So George said he came home unexpectedly and he found Billy in front of the refrigerator, buck naked. Naked as the day he was born. He said Tabby was still living there at the time and she was in the bathroom. He yelled at Billy it was totally inappropriate to be walking around naked while Tabitha was in there. Billy said he didn't know she was there, and George said there was no way he didn't know Tabby was there. He's asked about trust issues with Tabby, and he recalls her infidelity. And he said that finding Billy naked as a jaybird in front of the fridge, just an image I don't want to go to sleep thinking about here in a few, hopefully. He said that it caused him to have trust. I'm struggling, y'all. I swear that water is not vodka. Trust issues with his dad after that. So then they move on to Walmart, and he said he was in the car with Jake and the kids, and he didn't know what Angela was buying. So he is shown a photo of the car later on after he's arrested, I'm assuming. And it jogged his memory about that trip specifically because there was a table on top of the car, which they had gotten from Frederica's. And that helped him to remember that day. He said they had actually been to Klinger's, which is an accounting place that does their taxes in town. And they normally shopped at the Waverly Walmart when they moved to Peterson. And or at Bethel, they shopped at the Waverly Walmart. And when they moved to Peterson, they used the West Union or Hillsboro location. Angela never showed him the shoes, and he knew nothing about them. I wonder what size George is. I don't know that we ever got a size from when they had their foot impressions done. We know it was a 10 and a half and 11. Jake's, maybe tall, but he's kind of skinny. And I feel like, we know Billy has some big old claw hoppers. He said now that he knows Jake pled guilty, he doesn't like calling him his brother anymore. He's ashamed his family would do this, and he said he doesn't want to call Angela his mother anymore either. Ouch. I hope she gets the highlights on this on the local news. They show him the wish list of the guns. I didn't spend a lot of time going through this, honestly. He had George read all the guns off. This document was created February 11th of 2015, and it was last modified in May of 2015. He first saw it in Texas when they were working, and remember, Agent Scheider texted in that list. His understanding was that Scheider wanted to know about the Colt 1911-22, which was Jake's gun. He goes through the gun list about the guns, and he tells whether he owned them or not. Some of the guns was ones he didn't own, and some were ones he owned, far back as when he was a teenager. He said he has owned more SKS guns than he can count, and he said he had a lot of these guns. He said a lot of these guns are ones he never knew Jake to own, but he also said Jake made lists for everything, a list of tools he wanted, houses, what kind of furniture. He would make a list for the furniture he wanted in his house, a list of guns. And if he decided he wanted something, he makes a list, which further kind of makes me think Jake has OCD with lining up the soldiers or something like that. I mean, I have a family member OCD. It's a very normal thing to me, but just say it. I mean, there are certain things about the cleanliness and things like that. George talks about the recording about that list that they had in the truck, and he said he referred to it as a wish list, like the other wish list that Jake makes when he's interested in something. He said, for example, Jake has a list of tools um, that totals over $100,000 of his dream tools, and he has $17,000 worth of tools. So, like, he'll make a list of the things he wanted to add. He has shown the photo Scheider sent to him of that firearm, saying he wanted to talk to him sooner or later. If you remember, Scheider sent him the 1911 Colt, and then also a photo with that homemade silencer on it, and then some shell casings and stuff. And he said he had never seen that gun before, and he didn't know whose hand it was at the time, but now he knows it was Jake's. One photo had the homemade suppressor, as we know, and George said one time Jake tried building a silencer for George's AR using PVC pipe, and he said it detonated and exploded into 1,000 pieces, and he never knew Jake to use a mag light flashlight to try to make a suppressor. He said he didn't know about any oil filters being used to make suppressors. Okay, at this point, y'all, Parker's panic alarm is going off, and it has been going off for 5 minutes, and all you hear through the walls of the courthouse is, "Wah, wah." Finally, Parker's like, "Oh, Judge, somebody just told me that's my car." So, everybody busts out laughing, except for George. He didn't laugh. He just kept a straight face. He said he didn't know about any of the purchases for the murders, and the oil filter that he bought, if you remember, they tied that one purchase under his truck, so they were saying that he bought it. He said he did car maintenance for friends and extended family all the time, and oil filters was something he kept around. That's where we ended. He's still on direct. I imagine cross-examination is going to be quite explosive. I'm not sure who's gonna be up to cross him. I kind of have somebody in mind who I hope does, and we will see what happens. But guys, I'm gonna get this uploaded. It is 1:02 AM. I have to be up at 5, so I'm gonna get this out. If you're asleep, then you'll have it when you wake up. If you're on the West Coast, you're like, "It's getting to be bedtime. Where is she?" All right, guys, coming right to you. We'll see you tomorrow. We're gonna do this again. We're gonna break it down probably into 2 episodes. As you see, couldn't have done this in 1. Would have been way too long. So, we'll see you around lunchtime tomorrow and hopefully not as late tomorrow night. All right, we'll see you soon.